today we'll be continuing our topic which is on Incoterms, that is the International Commercial Terms of Trade. So since we were discussing about these terms and we were talking about the 11 common terms of trade which are being used by the exporters and importers in the case of international trade transactions. So among those we were talking about certain 11 the most commonly used Incoterms. So we'll be continuing about them and starting up for those which are there applicable in case of your sea and inland waterways. So these Incoterms that we are going to discuss right now, they'll be there focusing on to sea and inland waterways. Among that, the first one is cost and freight, which is CFR. Now this CFR is what it talks about, that okay, that obligations or the transfer of risk with respect to each layer of activity is there applicable onto whom? The buyer or the seller. So for each layer of activity, whether it is starting from export packaging to loading charges to delivery to the port area and then paying off the export duties, taxes and the custom clearances for the same, and paying off the terminal charges, and then making sure that the consignment, it is loaded on the vessel, it is there onto. So for that loading onto carriages or the carriage charges, insurance, so we are talking about that okay, the owners of the same, that is who will bear the obligation to pay for the things, who will be obligated by the you could say the very basic nature of these Incoterms. So that is how we are going to analyze about the same. So starting up with the CFR, which is cost and freight, and which indicates by the name itself that here the seller is supposed to bear the cost of freight and the very cost of your carriage. Now when we say the cost of carriage, that means that right before when the goods is reaches out to the destination terminal, and before that if the goods are there charged onto, you could say, a carrier or a vessel which takes away the goods from the exporter's point to the importer's point. So till that point the responsibility is there onto the seller. So right from when we say that okay, export packaging, that the exporter is supposed to pay the packaging charges on the consignment. So that obligation, that risk is transferred on to whom? The seller. That means any mishap in the conduct of the packaging of the articles which are consigned to be sent to the importer is to be borne by whom? The seller. The buyer will be paying a fixed price for the same as agreed in the terms of contract, as agreed in the contract of sale between the two. But any mishap, any damages in the process in case of export packaging, so that packaging wala jitna bhi aapka losses hai ya damages hai, it has to be borne by your seller. Number one. Number two, it says that loading charges. Now once the units are packaged there in a a warehouse, so further it has to be sent to the port area, right? So when it will be sent to port area, it needed to be loaded on a carrier. So those loading charges and correspondingly the risk of loading the units, and in case any mishap is there, mishandling of the article is there, that is also to be borne by the seller if the terms of contract is CFR, right? Further it says delivery to port. Now you have loaded the goods onto, let's suppose, that truck, right? Now that truck will be sent towards this port area from where it will be further put on to a on board with a vessel. So till that delivery to port, the burden again will lie onto the seller. He has to make sure to complete all the formalities to make sure that in case of any mishandling or any damages to the goods, the buyer will be paying as agreed upon the extra expenses which may be due to mishandling or damaging or sending a wrong consignment, they are to be borne by the seller. So obligations means every specific obligation till the article is there on board vessel, right? Further on, when you made sure that okay, the article has now reached the port, the seller has to make sure to pay all the duties, all the taxes, all the cess or the fee which are there in order to get the custom clearances. So again that onus is on to whom? The onus will be on to the seller. right? Then there are some terminal charges both at the origin port and to the destination port. So here in the origin terminal charges is to be borne by your seller. So that is why we say that okay, that this being the origin terminal charges, now who will bear those charges? The seller will bear the charges, because now the vessel, now the units are still not boarded onto the vessel. So until unless they are boarded on the vessel, all the obligations will be borne by the seller. So that is why the loading charges, which is your cost in freight, loading on carriages and the corresponding your carriage charges, right? So that charges will be borne by whom? It will be borne by your seller. Now onwards, when the goods are there on board the vessel and further they are to be transmitted to the place of the destination, now onwards every obligation and every risk will pass on to the shoulder of your buyer. That means now onwards in this journey, wherein the consignments are sent by the exporters and to be received by the importer, every ancillary expenses or every other charges now onwards will be borne by the importer. So now is what point? It is insurance onwards. Now insurance, always remember, until unless specifically mentioned in the contract of sale, it will be negotiable, right? Negotiable means that both the parties, the buyer and the seller, will look upon that okay, if the seller agrees that okay, he will be providing a basic limited clause insurance cover or a minimum coverage, so it will be mentioned in the contract of sale, and the buyer will be making a corresponding payment. And if the buyer wants an additional charge or the buyer wants an additional coverage, in that sense that the buyer wants ki let the seller be bearing the expenses till the units reach the ultimate point of destination. So in that case, insurance coverage will be wider and corresponding charges will be more. So those charges will be borne by the seller if the buyer desires, so the buyer has to pay correspondingly the extra charges for the same. So it is not like the seller is going to bear the brunt of those additional charges. It is the buyer who has to pay an equivalent extra amount for the additional coverage that he wants for the consignment, right? Now, one more thing that is worth noting out here is that indirectly all the expenses, they are to be borne by the buyer. So it is never like the seller is going to send the consignment and is also going to additionally bear the charges out of his own pocket. Obviously not, right? So that is why these Incoterms, they provide a standard measure that okay, if you say about cost and freight, the seller is also aware about the same and the buyer is also aware about the same. The point from where onwards the burden shifts onto the shoulder of seller, or from which point onwards it will be passed on to the buyer. So that means it is a very clear line with respect to the distribution of risk, with respect to the obligation to pay for the charges, right? So that means it provides a very clear standard format for the same. Now, as I said that insurance is one thing in this case when we are talking about CFR. So in this case, insurance is negotiable, that both the parties can negotiate about the same and can mention that okay, the buyer is going to bear the same or the seller is going to bear the same. So that's why it's like a negotiable very point, because insurance itself is such a contentious term which with respect to different countries, with respect to different regions, have different rules and regulations for the same. So that is why it requires revisiting to the same. It requires worth discussion, deliberations onto the same, so that none should bear the loss or with respect to the consignment that has been dispatched, right? Now, insurance is for the journey, as I mentioned, or maybe onwards. So that is why at this point we are saying that insurance onwards, now it is the risk transfer on the shoulder of your buyer. Now next is when the goods have reached the destination. It has moved from the port, right? Now it reaches the destination. So when it reaches the destination, destination terminal charges, delivery from destination port, to the main point, which can be any warehouse, any unit of the importer. So from delivery, from those terminal charges, whatever destination terminal charges are there, and then making sure the delivery reaches to the destination, and then because since the from the port to the point of destination you have to engage some mode of transportation, and for the same maybe another carrier will be engaged into, and that carrier will do what is, it will unload the goods at the destination, and then thereon there will be some import duties, taxes, or the import clearances, which in this case the buyer has to bear the brunt of the same or the burden of the same. So obligation, this point onwards, when we talk about that, it reaches the destination and the terminal charges, and to make sure to delivery to destination, to unloading the goods at the destination, and to pay for those import duties or taxes or clearances, is to be borne by whom? Is to be bear by the buyer, right? So buyer in this case will be responsible for any activity that starts from the terminal. So all the charges with respect to terminal onwards will be onto the shoulder of your buyer. So that is why it says cost and freight. That means up to the point of your freight, the charges are to be borne by your whom? The seller, and there onwards it has to be borne by whom? The buyer, right? Next point in this case is CIF, which is cost and insurance. Now cost and insurance on board vessel, herein we are talking about specifically the insurance parameter. The only change in this category is about your insurance. That means right from your packaging, again it starts from that point, right from packaging to making sure the goods being loaded onto the truck or any other mode of your carrier, be it any other mode. So then making sure the delivery to the port, getting those export clearances, paying off the taxes, paying off the terminal charges, to making sure the goods are loaded on vessel for when we say that on board vessel, and then paying off those carriage charges. Now the another point that was there, that insurance. Now here the seller is exclusively be held responsible to take a contract of insurance by with a third party, so as to cover the risk of damage or losses. So herein we say that specifically the focus is on to the cost plus the insurance, the cost of freight plus the insurance charges. So up till this point the expenses are to be borne by the seller, and this point onwards, that is again the terminal charges, delivery, unloading, and paying of the import duties or taxes or getting those import clearances will lie onto the shoulder of your buyer. So when we say insurance, because earlier what we have read about is that insurance is totally negotiable. This is the only point which talks about that, okay, not just negotiable, we are not keeping it open ended, rather we are bringing a clause for the same. We are talking about that here in this specific case of CIF, the seller is supposed to take the insurance cover. So now herein the seller will do what? The seller will take a contract of insurance. He will get into a contract with the third party wherein it will take the insurance cover for the consignment data to be dispatched. Now one important thing again with respect to the same, insurance cover doesn't mean that you take an extensive comprehensive cover for the consignment. In that case the cost will be much higher. So the seller, since he must have quoted some price, and onto those prices it will be difficult for him to complete this very to obligations under the CIF. So that is why the clause as given by ICC, it says that under this insurance point the seller is only expected to provide the limited insurance coverage. That means there will be a coverage of minimum possible. It does not talk about the maximum, it talks about okay, the basic, the very basic minimum, the seller should be expected to give only those insurance coverage. The seller is not expected to give a comprehensive coverage for the consignment. if the buyer wants an additional coverage of the consignment or the goods that are being dispatched, the buyer has to pay additional charges for the same. So, if the buyer says that I just don't want the coverage for that voyage, but apart from that I want that the loading unloading risk is to be covered by that insurance part, because I am not going to bear those expenses. Let us suppose that being the case. So, in that case, if the buyer wants an additional coverage, the buyer has to pay correspondingly additional charges for the same. So that this is a very beautifully conceptualized, you could say, these Incoterms. Why? Because they talk about that there should not be an extreme baggage onto the shoulder of your seller or onto the shoulder of your buyer. It says okay, under this term and condition, if this is being mentioned as a terms of trade, then the seller is expected to provide this insurance, but not beyond a point. Beyond a point, the buyer is expected to pay for the additional charges. So, that pays it is the nitty-gritties have been very carefully worked upon in this very specific case when we talk about insurance, because the insurance can, again, the coverage can be much higher, right, and it can be of any value provided you provide a corresponding charge for the same, right. So, that ways it talks about that in this case, and again this very Incoterm is there applicable only in case of your sea and inland waterways. The next very Incoterm. Now, this onwards, apart from your CFR, and when we talk about your CIF, because CIF we talk about cost and insurance, and CFR we talk about cost and freight. So, this terminology onwards, when we are talking about, it is now applicable. You engage any mode of transportation, you engage your rail, you engage the road transportation, you engage the airline or your shipping. So, any mode of transportation you engage into, then these terms of contract will be there applicable. It is only CIF or the other that we discussed in the previous segment. So, those were there not included when we talk about the any mode of transportation. So, those are only specific to sea and inland waterways. Otherwise, it is there applicable for any mode of transportation. Now, next we talk about is CPT, which is carriage paid to. Now, carriage paid to is, if you can see that it is talking about the place. Now, port is the point of origin, place is the point of destination. So, for the point of origin, we use the terminology port, and the place it will reach, the destination port will be considered, will be talked as your place. So, it will be referred as your place, and the initial point of origin will be talked as a port area. So, carriage paid to, now we are again talking about that now we are paying the carriage up till what point? Carriage paid to at the carrier. At the carrier means when the goods have reached that destination. So, not just the origin terminal charges, we are also paying the destination charges, destination terminal charges to be very specific. So, in this case, now again you would see that the term CPT, which talks about carriage paid to, it does not exclusively talk about the insurance parameter. So, thereby again the insurance is a negotiable factor. So, that means when we are talking about export packaging, again the burden would fall on the shoulder of your seller. When we talk about okay, now the packaging being done, it will be loaded. So, those loading charges again to the seller. Then delivery to the port again by the seller. The seller is supposed to pay, for those expenses. Seller is exposed to all the, if there being any damages, any losses. So, the seller is supposed to pay for those, because the obligation and the risk has passed on to the seller. So, delivery to port and then getting those export formalities to paying of terminal charges of the origin, that is your port point, and then making sure to get the goods loaded onto carriage, paying of those carriage charges, because we talk about CPT, that is carriage paid to to the point of place, right. So carriage paid to the point of place means that now the origin terminal charge is being paid, the goods being loaded on board the vessel, the carriage charges for loading the goods on board the vessel are paid off. Insurance since exclusively not being mentioned, so it is a negotiable terminology, right. So we will negotiate about the insurance. The seller is not supposed to take a different contract of insurance with the third party to provide for the minimum insurance coverage. So in this case the seller is not expected to do the same. It is negotiable. If mentioned in the contract, the seller would provide such service. If not, the seller will not exclusively provide for insurance coverage. Now the next point was what? That the goods will reach the terminal. So when we say destination terminal, so destination terminal charges are to be borne by whom? The seller. Now from when the goods have reached the destination and the seller has paid off these destination charges, mind it, the buyer has to be cooperative with respect to comparing or providing those basic documents for the import. So whatever documents are required from the importer's end, the importer will provide the same. So that is like unsaid rule, that is just like in general obligation wherein the buyer is supposed to pay for or to provide for specifically those documentation which are required for the seller to get the goods through this very point, that is a terminal point. So destination terminal charges to be borne by your seller. And now onwards, delivery to destination, the seller has only borne the charges of the destination, right, but delivery to destination, that very point, because one is your port and then from port to further area, that is onto the shoulder of your buyer, and there also the unloading expenses, getting those clearances, paying off the import duties, taxes, and then further taking the consignment to warehouses, everything to be done by buyer. Everything means it's just like more of a share of your obligation on the part of seller in this very Incoterm, and a lesser you could say obligations on the part of your buyer. So that being very clear that as we go proceed towards further terminologies, the more the burden, the onus of obligations or the transfer of risk will be on the shoulder of your seller. And more we go to that extreme side, when we talked about X works, the lesser burden is onto the your seller. So more is onto your buyer. So that means it very clearly specifies about the the roles, the responsibilities and obligations on the part of your seller and the buyer. Now next very is your cost and insurance paid to. So when we say carriage and insurance paid to or cost and insurance paid to, now we are talking about that. Okay, again this point, that is where in the very previous case when we talked about CPT, so we talk about carriage paid to, right, we didn't talk about the insurance parameter. Now we are saying carriage and insurance paid to, that okay, you are paying the carriage, but along with that you have to bear the insurance expenses also. Again, insurances to a basic cover, to a minimum charges it will pay off, not beyond that. So CIP is carriage and insurance paid to. Insurance, now you would see that it is exclusively being mentioned in the role, that it says that the Incoterm itself specifies that you have to bear the carriage and the insurance expenses, right. So when it exclusively talks about the insurance expenses, that means along with the carrier charges, the seller is supposed to provide the insurance cover, the very basic minimum insurance cover, and those charges till the destination terminal point, and there onwards a burden again will be onto the buyer. So that again exclusively that insurance wala parameter is decided in advance, that okay, this much share of insurance is to be borne by seller, and beyond that point, beyond that coverage point, the seller is not going to bear the risk of the same, right. So that means there are some obligations that has been very clearly specified through these Incoterms, and through this Incoterm the basic advantage is that the seller or the buyer need not to correspond to every rule on and on. Rather, if they specify, let's suppose they specify it as X works or CPT or CFR, or they talk about CIP. So that means they are very clear about that, okay, how much the burden is there onto the shoulder of seller and what point onwards it has to be borne by your buyer. So that means it is very easy to correspond to, and they are clear about their set of obligations and their rules, right, that are applicable to them. Now another point which is very important in this in respect to the same is your general obligations. Now general obligations say that whatever Incoterms we are referring to, no matter what, the seller is supposed to cooperate with the buyer at every point of the stage. So even if it is an extreme like X works, wherein the less of the burden is there onto the shoulder of your seller, the seller is still supposed to complete all the export formalities. Complete all the export formalities means provide all those documents which are required by the importer to get the clearances or to get the goods loaded on board, or to get the, or let's suppose to clear those custom clearances, even the export custom clearances. So that is a general obligation by the seller. The seller has to cooperate, the seller has to provide those invoices or the packing list. So commercial invoices, the seller has to provide for that. There is no alternative to the same. This is an unsaid rule, right? Similarly, when the seller will be dispatching the goods, the named port of destination, the named point of destination has to be mentioned in the contract. It is again an unsaid point that this the buyer has to provide ki, okay, this is what is the point where the goods would be received by him. And similarly, the seller has to exclusively express about that this is the point of origin. So the goods would transport from this point A to this point B, and both the points A and B would be specifically be mentioned in the contract, because with respect to the same, there should not be any confusion or tussle between the two of the parties. So that means they specifically go about naming those ports from which the goods will be loaded or sent for the exports, and the point where it will be ultimately be received by the buyer. So that is another general obligation. Third one is your notice, that the exporter is supposed to provide the sufficient time and intimation to the importer before dispatching the goods. So before dispatching the goods, the seller is supposed to send a note intimation to the buyer, so the buyer makes sufficient arrangement in order to receive the cargo. So that is a general obligation with respect to any of these 11 Incoterms that we are discussing. That goes on and on about any Incoterms. We will be talking about much more Incoterms in the second session. Thank you.